It is my absolute pleasure to invite to the stage Dr. Gillian Mandich, happiness researcher, or as I like to call her, the happiness doctor. Gillian is an award-winning, internationally recognized happiness researcher, speaker, educator, author, with a PhD from Western University in health science, and she does primarily her research on happiness and health. She is she was voted Canada's top 100 most powerful woman by the Women's Executive Network. And you probably recognize her from media. You've likely seen her on The Social, Marilyn Dennis, Breakfast Television, Morning Show, Global. But now, we dance. So up on your feet again. You know, I don't need to teach you. Up, 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 up we go. Get the energy up for Gillian. Happiness. Big. We got to see your dance moves just a little, Gillian. Just 30 seconds of what you got, because I've seen you on the dance floor.
All right. Oh, we're still dancing. Okay.
Like I don't care, baby.
All right. Who's happy? And we haven't even started the happiness talk, so that's pretty good, right? So Sandra gave me such a lovely introduction that I won't spend a lot of time, but I'm a happiness researcher. So I spend my days thinking and learning about how we can be happier. I led the largest national study looking at happiness in the workplace with the Canadian Mental Health Association. And I also, you might be wondering, why is someone who studies happiness up here at an obesity event? And how I came to study happiness was through my work in obesity. So my master's degree is actually in child and youth health. And I was working with children, and the way that I would invite a child to be in one of my research studies is if they had a BMI, and we just had Dr. Wharton talk about BMI, so we know what that is, above the 85th percentile for their age and gender in order to qualify for my research. And I started thinking, because essentially I was using the number on a scale to determine if I could help a child with my work. And so because my degrees are in health science, and health promotion is my area of research, I went looking into the literature to see what else could I study that impacted health that had nothing to do with the number on a scale. And so that's how I actually learned about happiness. I didn't know until the second year of my PhD that you could study happiness. So we're going to talk today about some of the research that I learned when we learned about the science of happiness. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what I call rethinking happiness, because when I got into the work, I quickly learned a lot. I had to unlearn a lot of things that I didn't know that I knew, and then relearn them. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the connection between obesity and happiness. And then we're going to get into some tools and strategies. So no matter how happy or unhappy you're feeling right now, by the end of our time today, you will have actual, tangible, evidence-based tools and strategies that you can use in your life to be happier. Does that sound good? Yes, thank you. All right. So I have to say that when I tell somebody I'm a happiness researcher, like the number one question that I get asked is, they're like, okay, Gillian, like, what's the magic pill, right? Like, what's the one thing I need to do or buy or get or say in order to be happy? And the truth is, there's no magic pill, there's no secret, but there is a science to it. So just like we can apply scientific principles to learn about physical activity, to learn about obesity, to learn about nutrition, we can also learn about happiness. But if you're wondering, like, is that a thing and how do you study happiness? Part of the reason is that it's a fairly new field. So it wasn't really until the mid-90s that a lot of research started growing in this field, which when you think about it, sort of is mind-blowing, right? That up until fairly recently, we never thought about what's good, what's happy, and how do we learn about that. So the cool thing is, though, that in the past 20 or so years, we've seen this huge increase in the body of work. And like I told you, when I went into the literature during my PhD and I was reading about it, what I read was that happier people are physically healthier. So when we compare happy people to unhappy people have lower rates of cardiovascular disease. They have stronger immune systems. They heal faster from injury. They tend to sleep better, both in terms of duration and quality. And they tend to make better nutritional choices. So that's pretty good, right? Because a lot of times we think that maybe happiness is just like a frivolous, smiley emoji type thing, but we actually can see implications in terms of our physical health. And it even goes beyond that into our workplace. So what we see is that, again, when we're comparing happier people to less happy people, in terms of things like creativity, productivity, dollars, like bottom line money, salespeople that are happier produce greater sales. We see that people are more productive, they're more likely to get promoted. So it really does extrapolate into other areas of our life as well, which is cool. And this happens because you might be wondering, okay, well, maybe at work, someone's got more education, they've got more experience, but when I'm talking about this today, that's after all of those things have been controlled for. And it even goes beyond that into our personal life. And I think that all of us who have lived through the pandemic, we understand that the lines can be kind of blurry, right, between personal life and work life sometimes. But what we see is that happier people have longer and more fulfilling marriages. They're more altruistic, so they're more likely to volunteer their time and or their money to help out. They have better friendships. So really, when we focus on one thing, our happiness, not only does it feel good, but we also see a lot of benefits in many areas of our life. And not only that, sometimes when I talk to people about happiness, I'll hear things like, Gillian, I would really like to focus on my happiness, but I've got a lot of other people to take care of. Or I'm not a selfish person, right? I want to take care of others. And what we see, and this is research out of the British Medical Journal, we see that our happiness can actually extend 3 degrees from us. So by focusing on how we feel, it affects the people that we meet, but then it also affects the people that they meet. So really, when we think about it from a total and complete picture, focusing on our happiness is something that's pretty important, and also it feels good. It feels good to be happy, right? This is my dog, Jocko. I'm obsessed with him. He's a little French bulldog, and he's got a question for us. He wants to know, is there actually something we can do about our happiness, right? Is this a set point thing? Is this a genetic thing? Or can we actually do something about it? So let's do a show of hands. Who thinks we can change our happiness level? Ooh, lots of optimists out there. Okay, who thinks we can't change our happiness level? We're kind of born with it. Smart group. Okay, good. So you guys are done with the talk. You can go home now. You know the answer. We think about some of those people. So the people that usually put up their hand when they say no are like the Eeyore type people. You know those people, right? The glass is half empty. But what we know from research is that there's sort of 3 main players in terms of our happiness. So the 3 major things that impact our happiness are 1, genetics. So they do play a role. So you can thank your parents or not, but that is the reality. But I think the important thing to know is the conversation doesn't end there. We also have our environment. Our environment, I think when we were in lockdown, we can all understand how our environment affects our mood, yes, right? And then there's a third piece. And that third piece is our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors. And so my work in happiness focuses on that piece, because we can't change our genetics, right? Maybe gene expression a little bit. I mean, we could all just get up here and move to Costa Rica and change our environment, but probably not going to happen. But when we think about our thoughts, our actions, and our behaviors, we live in our head every day, and we control what we do for the most part. So that seems like a good area of opportunity to actually make meaningful change in terms of our happiness, right? And so when we talk about the tools and strategies, that's what we're going to focus on. But first, I just wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about this idea of rethinking happiness. Because when I switched from researching childhood obesity to happiness halfway through my PhD. And as I started researching it, I also started to ask myself questions, right? Like, Gillian, are you as happy as you possibly could be, right? And I thought about it. I was going through a divorce at the time, so obviously the answer was no. And so I started thinking about it. I thought, I don't like feeling sad. I don't like feeling depressed. I don't like feeling anxiety. So Gillian, you're a researcher, so why don't you figure out how to get rid of all those challenging emotions and just be happy all the time? Sounded like a pretty good goal, right? Naive, maybe. But I was telling myself this story, and we tell ourselves this all the time, this idea of I will be happy when, fill in the blank, right? I will be happy when I have X amount of dollars, when I get this promotion, when I get married, when I get divorced, whatever it is. And I actually thought to myself a couple times during my PhD, I will be happy when I finish writing a PhD about happiness. So the reason is that we have this thinking that happiness is a destination, right? It's something that we will arrive at one day. But think about it. If you ever thought about this, I will be happy when, and say you get that thing, are you happy for life? No, right? Because happiness is not something that we find. We don't just get there and then we arrive there and then we're good, right? It's not an endpoint. It's not a destination. What happiness is it's a means to a life well lived. Now you might be thinking, okay, Gillian, that sounds like a really cute quote card for Instagram, but what does that actually mean, right? So what I mean is that if we want to live a happy life, then what we have to do is we have to practice happiness regularly. And you might be thinking, okay, Gillian, well, what does that mean? Well, The way I think about happiness is the same way that I think about nutrition or the same way that I think about physical activity. And we have my very adorable, he's 4 months old, and this puppy Jocko here to help us illustrate this example. So say Jocko went to the gym today, or you work out in your home gym, you do whatever workout you love to do, and you have the best workout of your life, okay? Would you ever leave that workout and take your phone and text a friend or a partner and say, I just had the best workout of my life, I've reached fitness? Would anyone ever do that? It sounds silly to even say, right? Okay, so say, for example, this morning you had this green smoothie and I put like all the superfoods in it and you drank it and you'd be like, thank you, Gillian, that was so good, I've reached nutritional wellness. Not gonna happen, right? Because what's gonna happen, lunch is gonna roll around and we're gonna be hungry again. We understand that if we wanna be fit and healthy, we have to move our body on a regular basis and we have to choose healthy food the majority of the time. So instead of thinking about happiness like a destination, as something that we're gonna arrive at perhaps one day in the future if X, Y, or Z happen, and instead we think about happiness the same way we think about physical activity or the same way we think about nutrition. It's a practice. It's something that we have to work at. So when we do that, what happens is, you know when you go in the gym and you start lifting weights, right, and your muscles get stronger? It's kind of like we have a happiness muscle, where when we do things to practice happiness, it's like our muscle gets stronger. So you see this kind of like uptrend, right? We're getting stronger. Now you might be looking at this very scientific graph here and thinking, okay, Gillian, well, there's still some like red faces there, right? Because the other thing is, a happy life doesn't mean that hard things don't happen, right? A happy life doesn't mean that difficult things don't happen, that pandemics don't happen, that job losses don't happen, that divorces don't happen, that illness doesn't happen. A happy life means that when we practice happiness and we start to grow that muscle, our highs get high and then our lows get higher too. So that when those things, those hard things, those difficult things happen, which they will, then what happens is we're able to cope with them in a better way. Does that make sense? Okay, so now I have 2 questions for you. So the first one, and feel free if you're brave to put up your hand, or if anyone in the Zoom that is watching us wants to put in the chat box. Anyone want to guess what the opposite of happiness is? It's a hard question. Yes, thank you. I thought it was sadness, yes. Indifference, yes. You guys are a really smart group. Apathy, yeah. Not caring at all. So when I first started studying happiness, I thought that the opposite of happiness is sadness. And I thought, I just want to get rid of sadness and just be happy all the time. But it turns out they're actually 2 separate constructs. So if you think about it like a continuum, you can be more happy and less happy. You can be more sad or less sad. You can actually be happy and sad at the same time. Does anyone know what that's called? The bittersweet emotion, right? So the opposite of happiness is not sadness. My second question, when you're having a bad day or an off day, how do you stay positive? Any guesses? Yes, Tabitha. Sorry? Gratitude. Good guess. I almost wanted to include that tip, but the answer to this one is you don't. Because here's the thing about happiness. We can't be happy all of the time. I see things, these are from Instagram. I see quote cards like this on Instagram all the time, and it makes me, like, it's not easy to just turn that frown upside down. Like if you're having a bad day, sometimes you're just having a bad day, right? So happiness is not about putting on rose-colored glasses and seeing the world or pretending like we want it to be something. The reality is we're humans, we have emotions, and they're complicated, and we can't be happy all the time. I love this cartoon. It says, I'm ordering a transfusion. We're gonna replace your B blood with B positive blood and hope that improves your mood. It's not that easy, right? That's not how it works, but that's also not the point. So when I started researching happiness, I really thought I want to figure out how I can be happy all the time. What I quickly learned is that you can't be happy all the time. But that's not the goal. And we actually see in research, sometimes it's referred to as like the dark side of happiness, where people who set their goal to be happy all the time, do you know what happens to them? They're actually less happy than other people. And you might think, okay, so I at least thought, how can that be? If I set my goal as to be happy all the time, and even if I don't reach my goal, like at least I'm trending in the right direction, right? Except then I thought about it some more, and what happens when we don't reach our goals? We get hard on ourselves. You know, sometimes I think if you took a microphone and stuck it in your head and people heard the way we were talking to ourselves, right, we would never speak that way to other people. So that's what happens here is that people, they actually end up being less happy. And now what we also know is, so like if we know that the goal is not to be happy all the time, and in fact that it is impossible to be happy all of the time, then what happens when we have some of the more difficult or challenging emotions, right? Sometimes we want to bottle them up. That's why I asked you what happens on a day that we're not having a good day. We don't have to force ourselves to be happy. And actually what we see is that when we suppress our emotions or we push them away, they actually get stronger. And I think we can all sort of think of that, right? It's like when we are trying not to think about something, what happens? We think about it even more, and this happens with emotions. And not only is it a bad thing in terms of our cognitive ability or maintaining or using up some of our cognitive resources, it actually can impact our health, our physical health, and even our cancer-related mortality. So when we know that one, we can't be happy all the time, and two, we actually have to embrace a spectrum of emotions. It's kind of like I do a lot of work with students, and I go to like high schools or work with student organizations, and I kind of talk to them and I say, you know, when you're in music class and you have a sheet of music, right? If you look at that sheet of music, there's high notes and there's low notes, and that's actually what makes a beautiful song. And so when we think about happiness, that was kind of dramatic, I like that emphasis, that if we just played one high note, one happy note all the time, would that even sound good? No, right? And so part of being a human is understanding that it's actually, and I love this quote from Susan David. This is from her book, Emotional Agility, which is an awesome book. I highly recommend it. But Susan David says that it's actually normal, healthy, and a good thing to experience the full range of the emotional experience. And I think this is really important for us to know because now we can give ourselves grace. If we are having a bad day, if we aren't feeling happy, to know that that's normal, right? And if you think about it, if you're at a funeral, does it make sense to feel happy? No, right? Sadness, grief, that makes sense. Okay, so I have two more questions now. These ones are a little bit harder than the first two. You ready for it? Yeah? Okay. This one you can answer in your head. If you're on Zoom, feel free to share the answer in your chat box if you want. But just take a second, close your eyes, and just check in and notice how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10. So 1, you are the least happy you've ever been in your life. 10, you're the most happy. And this is an awareness activity, not a judgment activity, okay? So I'll just give you a moment. Everyone have an answer? Okay, that wasn't so hard, right? Next one's a little bit harder, it's multiple choice, okay? So say today you won $10,000 in the lottery. And I said, congratulations, here's your $10,000, and I want you to spend that money in a way to maximize your happiness. And you have 4 ways that you can spend the money, okay? So A, you can go on do a home renovation or go on a trip wherever you want, whenever you feel safe to travel, okay? Home reno or wardrobe, B is trip. C is you budget about $200 a week a year for self-care, whatever that looks like for you, whether you like to buy yourself flowers, you like to order Uber dinner, you want to go for a massage, a concert, a movie, whatever you like, you get $200 a week for a year. Or D, you donate all of your money to your favorite charity. Okay, so show of hands, who would pick A? They want to spend their money. Sorry? Oh, well, then you can vote twice. So, okay, home reno, wardrobe. The women are like, can I get shoes? Okay, B, trip. Sean's not putting up his hand for a trip and he's leaving tomorrow. Okay, C, $200 a week a year. There we go. Okay, and charity. Pritty's like, obesity matters, we have a charity. Okay, so what's interesting is that we didn't see a clear-cut winner, right? The answer is actually C, $200 a week for a year. So you might be thinking, okay, Gillian, why are you asking me all these questions, and why is C the answer? So what we know from research is that as humans, we are pretty good at self-reporting our own happiness. So when I asked you on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you? Whatever number you came up with, if you were a research participant in one of my studies and I applied one of my fancy validated questionnaires and scored it and got a number, chances are that the score that I got was pretty close to what you just came up with in your head. So as humans, we are pretty good at self-reporting our own happiness. We're pretty good at figuring out how happy we are. But what we're not as good at is figuring out what it is that makes us happy. So we often think it's the big shiny moments, right? It's the new car, it's the promotion, it's whatever it is. We think that those things bring us the most amount of happiness. But what we know for research is that if we want to live a happy life, and I think the fact that we're having this conversation today suggests that we want to live a happy life, right? What that looks like is actually about creating small bursts of happiness throughout the day. And I'm using like air quotes because I don't mean small in terms of impact, I mean small in terms of time or effort sometimes. Because what happens is when we do a little thing in our day that makes us happy, one thing that happens is it creates what's called an upward spiral of positive emotion. We're probably more familiar often with like the downward spirals, right? Where you have like one thought and then like anxiety kicks in and then like all of a sudden the world is ending or you're dying or something, right? So they go that way very easily, but we also see the spirals go the other way. And so when we do one little thing, it's like, say, have you ever received like an email from somebody that just said something nice and then you feel a little bit better, right? Or you go outside for a walk in the middle of the day when it's not a snowstorm out and you come in and you feel better. When you start to add up all of those things, well, in the moment it may seem small. When you start to compound that over time, the effects are actually quite significant, right? And so when we think about building this happiness muscle, the way that we do it is by doing these small things over time that actually strengthen our muscle, and they help us to be happier than if we were just to think about focusing on that one day, that one moment, those things like that I will be happy when idea. So you might be wondering, okay, well, we're talking about obesity today. So how is obesity and happiness connected? Are they connected? So more questions. I love questions. So I'm going to do a quick little poll, and I want to know what you think. Do you think that people living with obesity are less happy, equally as happy, happier, or you're unsure? Okay, you ready for a poll? Less happy. Okay, equally as happy. Happier. Unsure. Okay, so we got a mixed across. What we see is that obesity impacts happiness in the UK, except when they account for self-reported health, we don't see any effect anymore. When we look in Indonesia, we actually see, you see the arrow is going up here, that it's actually a positive relationship. So this is a low socioeconomic status country. So here, having access to food is a signal of high socioeconomic status. When we look in the US and China, in China, we don't see any, we see that people are happier, but in the US we see nothing, no difference. So in summary, what we really see is that it's uncertain how much it affects us. We don't know yet. We're learning so much about obesity. You know, Dr. Wharton was talking about how much we've learned. It's really like that in terms of our happiness too. So let's end with a couple tools and strategies. I think you're all like, okay, Gillian, like, what do I do about it? When I leave here today, what do I do? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what I call the foundational three. So the foundational three are nutrition, physical activity, and sleep. We all know that those are important, right? We all know what it's like to get a good night's sleep and wake up. So those are all really important, but what I wanted to talk to you today, and there's more sessions coming up that are going to cover some of this stuff, so I want to talk about some other things. Does that sound good? Okay. I do want to say two things about exercise and physical activity, though. The tools I'm going to talk about, they are sort of habits that we build over time, but if you're in the afternoon and you're having a bad day and you just want to switch your mood, exercise or movement can be one of the most effective instant mood boosters. So whether it's go for a walk, put on some music, and it doesn't need to be like a whole long workout. Even 10 minutes of physical activity can greatly increase the odds that you're happy. So I talked about how thoughts, actions, and behaviors, right, in terms of our happiness. So one thing that we can do is we can cultivate a happier mindset. And I'll explain that in a minute, but first I'm just going to pause for a moment, and if you're in the room, I'm going to invite you to do this in your head. And if you're on Zoom, you can do this in your head or out loud, it doesn't matter. But just take a second and read the paragraph on the screen. How did that go? Was it hard? And then like the letters are all jumbled, right? I love Grammarly. This drives me, like I can't, it just like makes my skin crawl. Okay, so it was pretty easy to read that, right? Now the thing is, why was that easy to read? It's because we think we're like these rational beings that see everything exactly the way it's going on, but we're not. And so another example of that is we have this negativity bias in our brain. It's kind of like pre-installed software where, say for example, today you receive 10 compliments from 10 people. They say 10 good things about you, and one person says one bad thing. When you go home tonight and you put your head on the pillow, what are you thinking about? the one bad thing. That's a negativity bias. And so this sort of comes pre-installed for us, and if we don't want to do that, we have to override it. Now, I'm going to tell you how in a second, but first, again, we'll do this if you're in the room in your head. But what I want to invite you to do this time is to say the colors that you see, don't read the word. Okay, so say the color, don't read the word. So the first line would go like blue, green, purple. So I'll give you a second to try that. Was that one harder or easier than the first one? But the words are spelled correctly, right? Why is that? It's because our brain is a creature of habit. Our brain sees letters and it wants to read them. Our brain wants to go yellow, blue, orange, green, blue, right? And so if we want our brain to do something different, if you wanted to say the color, not read the word, what did you have to do? Try, pay more attention, right? Focus, slow it down. And so that's how we override the brain's negativity bias, is we understand that it's there, and now we have to pay attention to the good things. We have to start to notice them. We might have to slow down. It might take more time for us to actually be aware of the good things in our life. But what we do is, I always say, like, don't seek, like, don't go out and look for happiness. But part of happiness is actually taking stock of what we have in our life right now that actually makes us happy, right? But then life is kind of like a Where's Waldo book, right? You guys remember Where's Waldo books? Where it's like, okay, don't seek happiness, see happiness, but then there's so much going on. How do you focus, right? It's like when these picture and you have to look and you have to find Waldo. He's right there, by the way, in case you're wondering. But what we see is that when we start to look for the good, especially when we look at people that are living with obesity, it can suppress all the other things. So when we start to look for the good, it's really important. Now, this is my niece, Finley. And she's going to help us illustrate the next tool and strategy, which is controlling what you can. And so in research, we call this autonomy. And basically what autonomy means is that there are certain things in our life that we can control, and there are certain things that we can't, right? And so when we choose to give more of our focus and our attention to the things that we can control, that's really important. And what we see is that autonomy is actually more of a contributor to our happiness than how much money we have, how attractive we are, how good our sex life is, or how popular we are. So above all of those things, this idea of focusing on what you can control and giving more of your attention there is really important. And we see this in terms of obesity, where it decreases the individuals who report having limited self-control, but not otherwise. So when we're able to focus on the things that we can control, it's really important. So you might be thinking, okay, Gillian, that's cool, but like, how do I do that, right? So one of the things that you can do is you can ask yourself, okay, well, what can I control today? And so one of the big players is media, social media, right? This is coming from someone who's on TV all of the time, I'm telling you this. Because did anyone turn on their TV today and see something like this? I love it, it's so cute. It says, breaking news, local stingray in great mood. The water is nice and warm and its flappy parts feel very flappy indeed. Did anyone see news like that this morning? No, never, no. But it's very important, because this is work from Sean Aker and Michelle Gillian, and what they found was that even watching 3 minutes of news that you perceive to be negative in the morning, you have a 27% greater likelihood of reporting your day as unhappy 6 to 8 hours later. So it's not just a question of turn on the TV, turn off the TV, go about your day. The residue of that can actually stay with you, and it can actually have a negative or detrimental impact on your mood. So a couple things, right? Just really clear goals. I live in a condo, and sometimes I'm waiting for the elevator, and I'm scrolling, and I don't even realize I had taken my phone out of my pocket and started to scroll. Has anyone ever done something like that, right? Scheduling time, not first thing in the morning, all really important. And so the last tool and strategy that I want to share with you today is what we're already doing right now, which is connecting. Now, I did a talk at U of T last week, and I used this slide, and the students didn't get this meme. So I'm hoping we do here today, right? Remember that when you had to go ride around, see where your friends are? Because what we see is that in terms of our physical health, loneliness can be as powerful as smoking or alcoholism in terms of the negative effects it has on our health. So it's not just a question of like, I feel sad and lonely, it actually has physical implications. I love this cartoon. It says, nobody ever asks, how's Waldo? Right? So taking the time to connect with each other, to ask, how are you doing? And to have the conversation go beyond, I'm fine, how are you? I'm fine, right? And what we see is that social connection, not only does it increase our happiness, but it leads to both better health and longer life. And this is a quote from Dr. Robert Waldinger. He actually just had a book come out like a couple weeks ago called The Good Life. And so he's the lead study on the largest running longitudinal study about happiness. It's called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. It started in 1938, and they followed people, so the participants are dying now, and they're adding their children into this study. And this is a quote from him, and he said, "The lesson that came from tens of thousands of pages of research was that good relationships keep us happier and healthier." So really, it is so important because I think sometimes we get busy. It's like we can knock that item of calling a friend, going out for dinner off of our lists, and yet it's so important. This is such a cute picture. I did a talk at Lakehead University, and the professor that invited me after, she said, "Gillian, I really liked when you talked about how happiness is not a destination. It reminds me of this picture that I have on my fridge at home." And she sent it to me, and this is the picture. It's from a book called Big Panda, Tiny Dragon, and it says, "Which is more important?" asked Big Panda, "the journey or the destination?" And it says, "the company," said Tiny Dragon. And I think that's really important, right? Because a lot of our life really comes down to not just what we do, but who we do it with. And so think about for yourself today, who is one person that you can reach out to? And I want to invite you at some point today to text them or maybe even call them on the phone and just check in, because what that's going to do is it's going to boost your happiness because you're checking in on someone you care about. And it's also going to boost theirs because someone cared enough to check in to see how they're doing. So I taught at Western for 4 years, and like the professor in me cannot end without having a summary slide, so here you go. Right? These are the 4 that we talked about. There's so many. But I want to leave you just with 2 thoughts. The first one, this is a quote I heard Derek Sivers say on Tim Ferriss's podcast like 8 years ago. And he said, "If more information was the answer, we'd all be billionaires with perfect abs." And it's true, right? Because it's not enough. Knowing is not enough, right? I see that quote card on Instagram all the time, like knowledge is power, knowledge is power. And I'm always like, no, knowledge is not power, knowledge is potential power, right? It's what we do with what we know that matters. And the other thought I wanted to leave you with, this is actually from Dr. Yoni Friedhoff's old blog he used to do called Weighty Matters. And he says, "No one thing will ever prevent childhood obesity, or any obesity for that matter, because it's not how it works, right? There's no magic pill like I talked about. When we think about happiness, when we think about living a healthy life, whatever that looks like for us, it's really about focusing on, like I talked about, those small bursts throughout the day. It's not one thing, but when you add up all of those things cumulatively, that's what you see when you build the habits. That's how you actually make significant and meaningful impacts on your happiness." So with that, I had to leave you with one more picture of my dog, so there he is. And I don't know if we have time for questions. We do, okay.
Yeah, definitely
Yeah.
we have time
Woohoo.
for questions. So thank you so much, Gillian. That was amazing. I feel happy. So we'll start with, if there's nothing online, maybe we'll start in the room. We have someone with a mic if anyone would like to ask a question to Gillian.
Yes, we got one in the front. Oh, hold on, there's a mic. There you go.
Before you said like something about Indonesia, and I was wondering what that is.
Yeah, so when we look in terms of how happiness affects obesity, and happiness across the board, actually, like there's cultural differences. So even in happiness, right, we look at what makes us happy or what people are striving for in terms of happiness in North America. It's very different than if we jump across the pond to, say, China or Japan, where here we have a more individual culture. It's more me, I, versus over there where it's like a community or a collective we. So with obesity and happiness, what we see is that in Indonesia, when people gain weight, when their BMI increases, their happiness tends to increase too. And the reason is because that's a country that has very low socioeconomic status. So a lot of the people there don't have a lot of money. And so to be able to buy food is actually considered a good thing. So it's almost like when you are with a higher BMI, it's reflective of the fact that you can actually afford to feed yourself. So yeah, great question. Thank you.
Any other questions
other
for Gillian?
questions?
We have a question online.
Okay.
Okay, this question is from Chiquita Owens. How would you describe the difference between happiness and joy?
Ooh, okay, yes. Great question, Chiquita. So here's the thing. I didn't actually define happiness in my talk today, did I? No, and I would be willing to bet that if I went through and polled every single one of you here and every single one of you on Zoom, that we may have some similar definitions, but we're not going to all agree or we're not going to have the same one. And yet, I didn't have to define happiness for us to understand what we were talking about. Isn't that weird? Right? And so it's because a lot of happiness is very much a subjective experience. and different people experience happiness differently, and even you yourself throughout your lifespan. If you think about what made you happy when you were 5 years old versus now versus when you're 100, it changes, right? And so, yes, a lot of our happiness is actually just how we feel, which is all well and good until you're a researcher having to study it, when you have to define your terms and be very clear about what it is that you're studying. So the definition that I often use, which is commonly used in the literature, comes from Dr. Sonia Lyubomirsky, who's one of the leading happiness researchers. She's from California. And the definition that I use is that happiness is the experience of joy, contentment, and positive well-being combined with a sense that one's life is good, meaningful, and worthwhile. And the reason I use that definition is, one, that a lot of people do, but also the fact that it casts a very wide net or a wide umbrella. So when I talk about joy, contentment, and positive well-being, it encompasses all of them. Because even for myself, like tomorrow I'm gonna go to yoga class and I'm gonna lay in Shavasana at the end and I'm gonna walk home and I'm gonna be all like blissed out and peaceful, and I would probably tell you that I'm happy, right? And then when we were having a dance party here, we were probably happy. So happiness can look and feel for us, even ourselves, differently. And so when we think about sort of casting the widest net and including things like joy, including things like contentment, in the moment how we feel, but then also that other piece of the fact that one's life is good, meaningful, and worthwhile, right? That purpose, that legacy, that on your life reflecting back. And sort of when we add both of those collectively, you get a pretty good idea of what happiness is. Yeah,
Oh.
great question.
Love that definition. That is so good. I'm a definition geek, so
There
I
you
want to
go.
write that one down. Thank you so much,
Thank
Gillian. That was
you.
amazing. Thank you.